Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming here, as well as our online audience. Today, I would like to introduce Jennifer Blair. Jennifer obtained an undergraduate degree in biology from the University of Victoria and a master's in botany from the University of Manitoba. She then discovered a career in industrial hygiene and is now a certified industrial hygienist and a registered professional biologist. She has been assessing exposures in both workplace and community environments for over 14 years. Her areas of interest include biological assessments, indoor air quality, and investigations of former marijuana grow operations and clandestine laboratories. So I'd like everyone to give her a round of applause.
Thank you for the introduction. I guess one thing I omitted from the biography is currently work for a industrial hygiene, health and safety consulting company called Total Safety. Now, industrial hygienists have a lot of expertise, a lot of good skill sets that are traditionally applied to workplaces for the purposes of protecting workers. But those skills can be used in a number of different environments and for different problem-solving activities. And one of those issues where industrial hygienists have become involved is sort of a more community-based concern, and that is clandestine laboratories. So I'm going to talk to you today about how industrial hygienists can be involved in the cleanup of clandestine laboratories. I'm going to start by going through exactly what is considered to be a clandestine laboratory, what the main hazards are, what our local municipality cleanup requirements are for British Columbia. Then go through how an initial assessment may be done, the remediation plan development, and then verification of remediation to make sure everything's been cleaned up properly. So clandestine laboratories itself, the definition, because it's always kind of related to law and legality, can have some difficulty with it. This is not a legal definition. This is more, I believe, how it's commonly interpreted. So a clan lab would be a location where an illegal substance has been prepared or handled. So that can include the manufacture of drugs, so any sort of methamphetamines, ecstasy to fentanyl, growing of marijuana, the packaging, handling of drugs, such as cocaine. So they may not produce it or manufacture it, but they may repackage it, put it in a different form. It also includes the manufacture of explosives, chemical or biological weapons. I'm not talking about that category today in terms of weapons, focusing primarily on drugs and grow-ops. And in terms of locations, that really, it could be wherever your imagination could take you and then beyond somewhere. They can happen almost anywhere. So here's a few examples of places where you can have a clan lab. This is a bunker where there was a grow-op, so they actually took a container and buried it right underground. Cars, they're very frequent in the US, and I'm sure they happen in Canada too. We don't get involved in any kind of car remediation. The car would just be disposed of. The cost wouldn't be worthwhile. This was a grow-op that actually happened in a brewery in Ontario. It was a Molson brewery that shut down, and they set up a grow operation right in one of the beer vats. So people can be very creative as where they can come from. And then, of course, the Vancouver Special, where you can have a whole host of activities happening in just a regular house. So there's been sort of some shifting, some changing in the focus of where the different clan labs, where the focus has been of criminal activity. Now, this isn't supported by any data. All the data is fairly old that they get in terms of the number of illegal operations, and it's fairly difficult to track. So it's usually at least 5 years old. Generally, 5 to 10 years ago, there were a lot of grow operations. So municipalities were going through, and they could be, Abbotsford could be busting 100 in a year. Now they're maybe doing 1 or 2. There's very few grow-ops that are currently being busted, and it may be that they're not putting as much time and effort into it, and maybe that they're just not there. Because of the change in the political climate in the US, it's much easier for people to grow pot elsewhere. Historically, there's been a lot of meth labs with some ecstasy. That's moving more and more, just as you hear in the news, you're getting more fentanyl, some W18 labs, and then some unknowns. And there's sort of consistently a number of kind of other operations, whether it's cocaine or LSD or PCP. So in terms of hazards, you have the big hazards that primarily are going to impact the first responders, the people that are doing the operation, so the cooks themselves, and neighbors. So the top two are the most, the fire and explosion. They cause the most damage. It's the most obvious. It's when the first responders often get involved. And a grow-up generally, I believe, has about 25 times greater chance of having a fire than a regular house, just because of all the changes in the electrical work that's been done. You can run into problems with booby traps, particularly for those first responders. The cooks, sometimes they're exposed to their own drugs that they're manufacturing, and they can get very paranoid. Probably they do have some competitors, or maybe not, but there has to be an awareness of booby traps. And then you've got your standard chemical exposure. So you can have chemical burns, exposure to some very toxic materials, not necessarily the actual product, but some of the byproducts or some of the initial precursors that you're dealing with. You can get phosphine gas, hydrochloric acid, mercury, and a variety of solvents. There's also a concern with asphyxiation, particularly with the marijuana grow operations, because they often will take the exhaust vents from the furnace or the hot water tank, even from the chimney, and they'll vent it back down into the grow area because they're wanting to get more carbon dioxide. Not only is there carbon dioxide that's put into those areas for the plants, but it also puts carbon monoxide into that area. So you can run into some problems with both high levels of carbon monoxide and pushing the oxygen out. So these are just a few examples of some of the aftermath. The house there from the outside, that was a grow-up that was discovered because of a fire. And the one at the bottom and showing the kitchen, that was an explosion from a meth lab. So in terms of residual hazards, so I'm not focusing a lot on the first responders and those hazards. I'm focusing more on what's left behind after. So you get a lot of electrical damage, structural damage. They may take walls out, put holes through the walls. It's a lot of changes to the various systems in the house. So if it's a plumbing deficiency, they may have routed the water supply right into their fertilizer tanks, or disposed of their process chemicals down through the drain, so they're going to eat away some of the drainage system. As I mentioned before, changes to the ventilation systems. You can have water damage, particularly with the grow-ups, which then results in mold growth. And there can be residual chemical contamination, which can get onto the building materials or inside the building materials. And this can include the final products, the waste products, and the precursors. There's also a potential for soil or groundwater contamination. The making of illegal drugs produces a lot of waste chemicals. People have to get rid of that chemical somehow. Some put it down the drain, some put it outside. If there's a septic system on the property, that definitely can run into some concerns with the soil and groundwater contamination. So this just shows some of the electrical modifications that can be made in a house. Some of them can be done quite well. An electrician may even have done the work, but they're still not done to code, and there's often a number of problems with them. So that's why you get a lot of the fire hazards. In terms of the chemical contamination, so the top two pictures, these pictures are showing residual, the fertilizer containers that are left behind following a grow operation. And the bottom two are both from meth labs. And this would have been their cook bench, where they would have done all the work, their laboratory bench, as well as this table was the primary cook area. And you can visually see some of the staining and contamination that's left behind. In some of the operations, the cooks are trying to protect themselves. You often see respirators around. And in both of these cases, there were actual ducts that had come into the cook area that were going to provide some local exhaust ventilation for the people that were doing their cooking. I don't know how effective they were, but there was some evidence they were trying to keep themselves safe. So most of these pictures are from a grow-up, these three here, and they're just showing some of the structural or building modifications. So this is in an attic space, and there's often a lot of venting from a grow area it's very hot and humid and they want to get rid of some of that air. So they put it up into the attic space. Sometimes vent it directly outside, but not always. This is typical. They will cut holes throughout the house to get their ductwork up to the attic. And in some cases, they do a great job of it. They build nice structures. So if you put furniture and a few contents in there, you would never know that there's ducts from a grow-up going up into the attic when you look in the main living room at this protrusion here. This shows a meth lab in a crawl space, and they actually dug out the crawl space more to give them more headroom. So again, you could get into some structural problems of the actual building if they're digging down too far. So the typical process, which happens in British Columbia, is that the operation is busted, and that could be that it's a fire, an explosion, so it's triggered that way. You find out that it's there when the firefighters arrive. Or they've gone in through a criminal activity and the police have arrived. Or historically, I don't think they're doing it as much anymore, but they would look at power usage and power consumption of certain homes, and they would target those homes. So if the power was spiking, then they would go in and they would do an inspection of that home. It may not necessarily mean that that homeowner would ever be criminally prosecuted or the people running the grow operation, but that would be their kind of indicator and target, and they would break up the operation. So following its identification, then the hazmat team would secure the site, and they generally remove the gross chemicals. So they'll remove the big drums, the obvious material that's there will be removed by the contractor, typically working for the police. The municipality then gets involved and they would disconnect the utilities. The municipality, again, this is kind of their role of what they've put in. They then remove the occupancy permit and they notify the homeowner. Not always as closely connected as you think. Sometimes takes them a couple weeks to track down and notify the homeowner, particularly if they're overseas. Then it comes down to the initial assessment, and this is where an industrial hygienist may be involved in doing the assessment of that property. Then you go through and do the remediation and cleaning, and again, the IH may be involved to oversee the remediation and or to put the remediation plan together. Then comes for the final inspection and certification of the property. So you get the hygienist involvement at the end. So this was a house in Mission in 2014 where there was the ecstasy lab, and this is just an example of the removal of that gross contamination. See, there's a lot of chemicals that are there, but usually all that has been removed by the time we might go in and see it. So once the chemicals have come out, the city posts notices on the property that it's not safe to occupy, and the occupancy permit has been removed. So all municipalities have different bylaws. They're not the same, but they're similar, and some municipalities don't have them. An exception is the City of Vancouver. It doesn't have a bylaw, but it operates in a very similar manner, and their official stance is they do it on a case-by-case basis. Nanaimo has some specific requirements that it requires viable air sampling for marijuana grow operations. That's unique to Nanaimo and isn't present in any of the other British Columbia municipalities. So they all have some unique variations, but they are sort of written in law. Because municipalities have no control of the criminal code, they're just dealing with what they can control. So that is with the utilities hookups and occupancy permits. And I'm going to be talking about sort of the health and safety aspect of these homes. The bylaws also address other issues like electrical connections, structural, as well as just building code in general. So if you have an older home, some of the bylaws actually require that that home be brought up to current building code standards. So it can be very expensive and costly for a homeowner, even if there is very little damage associated with the operation, just to bring it up to meet the current bylaw standards. And some homes, they don't choose to do that. They just demolish them and would build a new one. Some of the cities do levy large fines and inspection fees. And a number of the municipalities have also run into some legal ability to actually implement these bylaws. There have been cases where they've gone in, they've seen high power consumption in a house, they've gone in and done an inspection, charged that homeowner with a $5,000 plus inspection fee, and they were doing no illegal operations. They just may have had a pool and a sauna and air conditioner, so they had legal reasons why their power consumption was high. And some of these homeowners have gone back and sued the municipalities and have won. And because of that, the City of Mission, District of Mission, they've actually withdrawn their bylaw and they no longer enforce it because they were running into too many legal issues associated with it. This is, I've pulled out a few examples of, or excerpts from the City of Surrey's bylaw. It was originally written in 2006. It has been revised several times, and probably it's the most, kind of the best bylaw, I would say, that's out there currently. So they define a qualified person as an individual or corporation who is a certified industrial hygienist, a registered occupational hygienist, a registered professional biologist, and a PhD mycologist. Not sure originally how all those got in there, but that's what they define their qualified professional as, and that they carry environmental liability insurance. So the City of Surrey's bylaw also specifies what's required for remediation. Now it has in here that this must be done within 14 days. I'm not sure I've ever seen a property be remediated within 2 weeks. It takes much longer than that, but they don't seem to ever enforce that time period, as long as it's done in a reasonable amount of time. So within the City of Surrey's bylaw, it actually specifies that they remove and dispose of all carpets and curtains in the building, and if the building has heating ducts, that they be cleaned, and that all walls, floors, insulation, moisture barrier, and ceilings in the building be replaced and cleaned and disinfected by a professional cleaner. Now, it's pretty hard to clean the insulation if you've got drywall on the wall. You have to either remove the drywall, and in some cases that's not required. They've written this as a guidance. In actual kind of implementation of it and talking to the bylaw officers, they will take it on a case-by-case basis. So if the professional involved doesn't determine that you need to take all the drywall off to clean the insulation, which would be very difficult to do, they sort of leave that on the professional that's doing the inspection of the property. So after the cleaning has been done, the bylaw then requires that you provide written certification, and it's in a special form that's provided by the city, that the building has been cleaned and it's substantially free of any pesticides, fertilizers, toxic contamination, molds, or fungi prior to occupancy of the building. It's a pretty long list that they throw in there of what they want to certify the building is clean for. And there's an example of the City of Surrey's certification form. It's an older version. It's been a couple years since we've actually done one in the City of Surrey, and I couldn't confirm that they're still using this exact form, but it's very similar in a number of the municipalities. That's the one example from Chilliwack. So they basically, you have to sign off saying that the property is free and safe to occupy. So as a consultant, we get a phone call from a homeowner or the homeowner's representative saying they need a certificate signed. That's usually how the conversation starts. They want something signed off on. And you start asking questions and kind of leading down the process, so then you realize that you're dealing with somebody who's had an illegal operation in their house or rented house, or they're the realtor, or it takes you a while to sometimes figure out the whole train back of who actually owns the property. But you have to start getting as much information as you can about this property. So trying to obtain the current, like what's the current condition? Has there been a fire in it? Is this person you're talking to on the phone, have they actually been to the property? Oftentimes they haven't, so they really have no idea of the condition of the property. So you start by asking other questions to get as much information as you can. How long was it rented for? Is there more than one tenant? Because that can sometimes give an idea of the extent of the damage. And has there been any cleanup work done? Some people try and clean it up themselves. They go in and they start removing everything, or there's been nothing done. We then often contact both the municipality and on occasion the RCMP, particularly if it was a drug lab, to see if we can obtain more information on the property. People will say it's a meth lab, but that's just a common term that's used. It may not be a meth lab. They may say it's a grow-op when it was actually a drug lab. So oftentimes you have to kind of use all the resources you can in order to even just get the information together. Other methods of kind of pulling in background information is if it's a large one, or if it was kind of in a high-profile area, the media actually might have some information on it. And sometimes you get some idea on the precursor chemicals. So there may be containers outside that somebody's seen that tell you some of the ingredients that may have been used. So that may be able to tell you if they were manufacturing a certain type of drug. Sometimes if you're talking to the RCMP, you can find out the actual method that was used, which really helps trigger down the types of chemicals that may be present. And there's geographically, there's certain methods that would be used on the West Coast versus the East Coast, and it primarily has to do with the access to different chemicals and what they can start with. So sometimes you can get all of this information. We have done several properties where we've actually worked for the federal government for the seized property, where they have gone in and seized the home out of the proceeds of crime. And then they've gone through the court system. At that point, everything's open, and they're happy to provide you all the information. Other times, you're told nothing. You're basically going in blind to the property. So this is where we start with the initial site inspection and sampling. So we always assume the worst when going onto the property. We want to make sure that our people are protected and we're not going to be exposed ourselves. You have to inspect all areas of both the interior, the exterior, and any outbuilding. So if it's an apartment building, a 600 square foot apartment building, pretty easy to scope out the areas that could be damaged. If it's a rural property, sometimes you're like traipsing through the back of this large acreage to see if there's any buildings or barns that could have other activities going on. And it's not unusual for chemicals to be stored somewhere else on the property. And when it comes time to certify the property, you're certifying everything that's at that address. So it is important for us, for our liability, to have a look around at everything on the property. So we first determine what type of PPE that's required for going on to the site. And that's dependent on the background information that we have. If it's a drug lab, typically when we're doing the initial inspection, we do go in with a chemical suit and we're wearing a full face powered PAPR respirator with gloves and boots. For a grow-op, probably not that high level of personal protective equipment, but if we're not sure, we'll go on the side of safety. I want to make sure we take care when we're moving around in the property. The power's out. They're often very dark. You can't see anything except with the lights that you're bringing in. The homes and the apartments and buildings, they're filled with a lot of material. People, if they've been cooking and then they're smoking the methamphetamines particularly, they just accumulate belongings. It's quite amazing. The rooms are just completely filled. You can't enter them. And then when you leave the property, making sure you're fully decontaminating yourself and anything that you may have taken in there, like a clipboard or a camera, to make sure you're not going to transfer that contamination elsewhere. During the initial site visit, we may choose to do sampling or monitoring. And that could be some direct read monitoring, primarily for ensuring our safety so that we're not going to run into an area where some gases may have accumulated. We may do surface wipe sampling to determine what contamination might be there. pH testing, if it's an acidic or basic, particularly if there's like a pool of chemical that's still remaining. And it may involve some destructive investigations. So that's Pierce from our office, suited up for his first inspection of a drug lab. And we're still not sure what that drug lab was manufacturing yet. So these are pictures primarily from a grow-op. And you can see here just there's piles of, we believe there's soil in there, but you don't know. And if it was a drug lab, you wouldn't want to start opening any kind of bag like that. What they can do with their waste products is they fill plastic bags with kitty litter, and then they would run their, kind of bubble their solutions through it, and yet phosphine gas can accumulate within that enclosure, and they're called death bags. And if you actually open it up and you weren't properly protected, it could kill you. So some of the waste products left behind can be very toxic. There's always a lot of soil in a grow up, sometimes in pots, sometimes they just fill the basement. The poly is on the wall, and this is where getting into destructive investigations is really important because you don't know what's behind that poly. And you pull it back, and there can often be a lot of mold growth because of the history of the water damage and water usage. So in terms of chemical contamination, they use a lot of the fertilizers that are used in large drums that's often plumbed right into the plumbing system. And again, you've got waste that's being disposed of in the toilet. And here, this was a fire, and you can't even go in and investigate those areas because you have to think of your safety first, and you don't know how structurally sound the roof may be, and there's no footing below. There's nowhere safe you can walk on below. And there's just, you can often get very large piles of waste material. This kind of pile of garbage bags and cold tablets probably stood about 3.5, 4 feet high in the room. This was after an explosion of an ecstasy lab, and it just left a fine dust of precursor and ecstasy kind of everywhere. So a very fine powder that gets quite extensively spread. So in terms of what you would want to test for, it really depends what you're looking for and what the original damage to the property was. So for a grow up, you've got a lot of water damage, so you're going to be focusing on mold. Mold on the surface and mold in the air. You also are looking at pesticides and fertilizers, as those are the chemicals that may have been used. It's also, when you're thinking back to signing off and certifying the property, that's what some of the municipalities want you to look for. They want you to make sure that there's no pesticides or fertilizers present. For drug labs, when you know the end product of what they were trying to manufacture, that's a very good target to look for if they were successful. It doesn't mean that there's not other types of contamination present, but you can use that as your indicator to determine the extent. And there's been a lot of research and work done in the US, particularly related to methamphetamine labs, where they've actually done cooks in a controlled environment in a house that was going to be demolished. And the amount of methamphetamine, kind of light, very small particulate that makes its way throughout the house is quite high. It distributes very evenly. For drug labs with unknown products, where you don't know what it was that they were making, you can do a full drug screen for the available drugs that are out there. You can check for precursors if you know if there were certain precursors that were used, or you may determine that there's another indicator that you're going to use for the level of cleanliness. And then, of course, building materials. So if it's an older property and you're asking them to take out their drywall and the flooring and the finishing materials, we always, as a industrial hygiene consultant, have to consider the presence of asbestos and lead. So this is just some of the photos going in of doing initial sampling. So for the stove, we're taking a sample from where they may have done some cooking there. It's obviously dirty. My recommendation would be that that stove is going to be removed and disposed of. The purpose of that sample is to determine what is there. What were they manufacturing? There are some available test kits for methamphetamine that are direct read, and they'll tell you on site within a matter of about 5 minutes if there is remaining methamphetamine. They're only available, as far as I know of, for meth, and the accuracy isn't as good as if you were doing a wipe test that you sent to the laboratory. There is a NIOSH method for methamphetamine and other illicit drugs and precursors. So most labs are standardized in terms of their methodology of the analysis. This is a little bit more recent, hasn't always been this way. There was quite a bit of variability with the labs when it was originally a problem, but they are becoming a lot more consistent with their analysis. One concern we have is we use a lab in the States, and when you send something by courier to the US, you always have to declare that there's no hazardous materials in the shipment. And when you don't know what you're sending, it can get you're not so sure you want to sign off on that form. So our workaround is we found a local office of the lab that they'll send it out across the States for us, and we don't have to worry about signing the paperwork. So in terms of, you've kind of put together your sampling plan, and now it comes to interpreting your results. With any type of industrial hygiene sampling, how you're going to interpret your results depends on your hypothesis and what it was that you were trying to sample for and what you were trying to do. So was the sampling to determine the extent of contamination? So if the cook area was in the basement, is the sampling to determine if the attic space was affected? Or is it to determine the level of contamination? Are you dealing with a little bit of contamination on the surface that can be cleaned? Or are you dealing with a lot of contamination that's going to require removal of that building material or that product? And as I mentioned before, a lot of the sampling we do at the initial site visit is to determine what is there. We've had some cases where it's very obviously a drug lab. There's been a lot of damage, and a drug screen picks up nothing. It's clean. Visually, it's not clean. It just means that they're probably manufacturing something that wasn't within that drug screen. They're probably making something else, or they were unsuccessful at actually making their end product. They blew up their cook area before they could make their drugs. Oftentimes, the extensive sampling prior to remediation is not that cost effective. It is an expensive sampling process, and if you can visually see that a lot of remediation needs to be done, it's not always a requirement to sample during that initial phase. So once you sampled, you've not sampled, you've done your initial assessment, then it comes time to develop the remediation plan. There's quite a bit of guidance for remediation of particularly methamphetamine laboratories. Most of it has been driven out of the US. There's less information available, but still becoming more so on for grow operations. So there is quite a few resources available, and these are just some examples. The EPA has recently, or I guess 3 years ago now, published voluntary guidelines. This is a Canadian organization, the National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health. They've published something, and the AIHA. And many US states have very specific regulations on how the cleanup process is supposed to proceed, as well as which contractors would even be allowed to do the cleanup. We don't have those in law regulations here, but we can use all their guidelines that they've put out. So there's quite a bit of resources available for that. So in terms of developing the remediation plan, some key things that we usually consider and look at are specifying what the contractor qualifications and experience are. So not just a cleaner, and this is where some of the wording and terminology with the bylaws gets confusing. They refer to a professional cleaner. Well, Molly Maid should not be, they are a professional cleaner, but they should not be cleaning up drug labs. You need somebody who's dealing more with, who's had experience dealing with hazardous materials. In the remediation plan, you need to specify the level of worker protection and the level of decontamination. So in some cases, the workers may need to go in an SCBA or on airline to ensure they're properly protected. The containment, if it's in an apartment building or a commercial complex where you've still got occupied neighbors, during that remediation, it's really important that the area be controlled and contained so you're not going to cause any additional contamination. Ventilation, so making sure that there's enough ventilation both to help protect the workers and again control the air movement. You have to specify what to do with the contents. Can any of the contents be kept, or do they have to be disposed of? It may come into the value of the content, sometimes can impact that. Sometimes there's no choice in the matter. The building materials, Usually we consider whether they're porous or non-porous, if they're in the cook area, if they're not in the cook area, if they've had a lot of water damage, if there's mold growth on them. Ventilation, the ventilation systems, notoriously they get impacted by the drugs. They're very hard to clean. We usually specify removal. Oftentimes people don't want to remove the ducting, and they do try to clean them, but it's usually unsuccessful. In a single family home, it's not such a big deal to take out the HVAC ducting, but when you're dealing with an apartment building and an exhaust fan that runs several stories up through the ceiling or out through the side, it can get very costly to deal with that ductwork. Also with apartment buildings, you can run into concerns with the hallway outside or the elevators or the ventilation system that's servicing those common areas. And again, as I mentioned, the exterior, have to consider those as well. So somebody comes in and does the remediation. Sometimes we're involved in the process, sometimes we're not. Sometimes the homeowner, for cost reasons, decides to do it themselves. In many municipalities, it's not specified who can actually do the cleanup. And the homeowner can do it if they choose, some places. Sometimes the homeowner does a great job and contractors do a poor job. So the quality of the actual cleanup work can be quite variable. So then we need to go in as a hygienist and certify and ensure that the remediation has been done properly. So again, we go through this by going and doing a visual inspection of the property. Still have to make sure that we're properly protected when we go in. A little bit more knowledge because we've been there before. We've done some sampling. Gives us an idea to determine what level of PPE we need. And then we have a look around. So have they actually removed what they were supposed to have removed? Have they removed the carpet? Have they removed the contents? Have they removed the drywall that was specified? It's quite surprising, even though you list it out for people, that they don't take out the fridge because they really want to keep it. So that's sort of the first check. And does it look clean? So can you actually see dust on the surfaces? Is there staining that's still there? If it doesn't look clean and they haven't done what they're supposed to do, we usually don't go much further than that because the sampling is probably still going to detect elevated levels. But if it all looks clean, then we would go through and do, primarily for a drug lab, we would do wipe sampling. You can do sampling in air, but if the house is unoccupied, there's not a lot of air movement, most any residue at that point is going to have settled on the surfaces. So we would do wipe sampling for the drug residue. Usually at this point we would know what that drug residue is, so we can target to look for the one end product. If it's a grow up, we would also do sampling for pesticides and fertilizers. Air sampling, if there was a concern with mold, and mold can result not just in a grow up, but it could also be in a meth house that had a fire and it had a lot of water damage, and then you get the mold growth. And you can do air sampling for drug residue and solvents if that's a concern as well. So then you get the results back and you're needing to figure out how clean is clean. So at what level are you going to specify that this house is safe for occupancy? And we're not just dealing with workers at this point, you're dealing with the community at large. So there could be a brand new baby that would be living in this house or a toddler that's crawling around on the floor. This is some results of one house that they were manufacturing methamphetamine. So this is following the first clean. And we still were getting levels in the ductwork of 84.3 micrograms per 100 square centimeters. It was cleaned a second time, and those levels in some areas decreased, but not other areas. And this is the Washington State decontamination standard. So we don't have any standards in Canada. A number of the states do have clearance standards. They clearly state that it is not a health-based standard. It's based on analytical detection limits and feasibility, so of how low it could possibly get. Now, when the standards were published, probably that may have been the analytical detection limit, but the methods have improved so they can detect levels at much lower amounts. And it's you have to consider a number of different things when you're looking at what the clearance standard is. You could just use this hard number that's really not based on much of anything. You could go with the idea that we're dealing with methamphetamine. It's not something that's normally in our environment. It's not like mold that's everywhere. So would you accept any levels of methamphetamine on your floor that your toddler's crawling around on, that they could be exposed to? It may be that maybe you'd accept this 0.1 micrograms per 100 square centimeters on a concrete floor that would have a finished floor put on top of it. But I would still say that some of these levels, even in the ductwork, even though that's below the Washington state standard, if it's in the ductwork and it's blowing out air throughout your home continually, I think that's too high. This house was cleaned at least a third time, and I think it had a fourth cleaning before we actually accepted it as being cleaned. But the interpretation of the samples can be problematic. And that's for the meth labs where there are some standards available. For the grow-ops, the cities want it sort of certified that it's pesticide fertilizer free of substantial contamination. Now, pesticides, some would argue that they don't really use them that much in grow-ops. Sometimes they do get used. Either way, we do detect pesticides in homes, whether they were there for an ant problem or they were associated with the grow-op. These are some of the common pesticides that are detected. The World Health Organization specifies a daily accepted intake of pesticides. So because there are pesticides in our food and in our water, in our general environment, they've sort of accepted there's a background level. So if this is what they've accepted in terms of food, of what people can consume, we had used these levels with the kind of a model of a toddler crawling around on the floor, and we used a 8-kilogram toddler, which would be probably a pretty small toddler, covering an area of 500 square feet in a single day, getting it on their hands, getting it on their toys, and consuming it. And based on that, then we would determine what a safe level is for pesticides on surfaces. So a little bit out of the box of a normal industrial hygiene workplace in terms of dealing with worker exposure. We're now dealing with children in their home, but it's still going through the same rationale and the same process of what sort of level would be a safe level. So after the sampling has been done and the inspections have been done, then comes the step of actually, as a hygienist, determining if this property is safe for occupancy again. And I kind of always, whenever I sign one of these forms, I might kind of take a step back and think, okay, would I be willing to live in that house the way it is? And if I'm not, then I wouldn't sign the form. It would only be as if I wanted my family to live in that house. The other thing that I have done to many of these forms is I have changed the wording on them. So some of them are pretty vague and they're very poorly written. So I have definitely crossed out and reworded and put my initials on to make sure that I'm comfortable with signing what these certification forms is. And I've talked to the municipalities and they're quite happy with changes like that because they understand they've tried to fit one form for all situations and it's not always the case. So the signing of the forms, and this is just to kind of follow up on some of the wording that has been changed, is they specify, pesticides, fertilizers, toxic chemicals. This one here, it's substantially free of the same thing. You don't always sample for everything because you do still have to consider the history. So that's where if it was a meth lab and we wouldn't have sampled for mold, I may cross that section off because it's not applicable. So that's sort of the majority of how a hygienist gets involved in a clandestine laboratory. There's a few other things that pop up now and again, and one of those is the property resale. So once a property has been determined to be a clan lab or a grow-op, it's basically flagged. So there's a disclosure statement that goes with that property. So it could be 10 years down the road, somebody's purchasing the home, and the mortgage broker looks at it and says, well, we can't insure this, or we're not going to provide a mortgage for this home because it was a grow-up at one point. So they would then require an environmental inspection 10 years later, and that has a sort of a whole, there's usually a lot less contamination, a lot less things to worry about. It's more going through the process to meet the financial requirements. But there are surprises, because some of them may not have been cleaned up properly the first time. The BC Ministry of Environment also requires that for any clan lab that a site profile be completed. So it does include ROAPs as well, and this is so it can be flagged in their system, and their experts can review it to determine if there's a concern for the groundwater and the soil contamination. And if it gets flagged through this site profile system, then they would require extensive and very costly subsurface soil investigation. That's outside of my area of expertise. You'd sort of go into the professional engineers, the soil scientists, they look after that. But it is another piece of these operations. And that's just a bit more information on the BCMOE contaminated sites. And we do make sure for our clients that we make them aware of this process. So that brings to the end. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thanks for a fascinating talk about a fascinating aspect of the profession. I just wondered, is it at all, does it at all happen that they just tear the house down?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
How frequent is that?
You know, we don't know because we're not involved. They may make that decision before we would even see the property. So it is frequent, particularly, depends where the property is, but because of the real estate market, the land value would be worth a lot more than the cleanup costs. So yeah, it does happen very frequently.
And, just one other question. I just wondered where all the stuff gets taken, like just to regular landfill or?
No, it gets disposed of as hazardous waste. Yeah, so I think, fortunately, I think some of it does go to Alberta.
Thanks, Jennifer. That's very informative. A couple of questions come to my mind. One is that you mentioned that chemicals get dumped down the drain, so it goes into the public system. Does that pose a threat, as far as you know, and what's the mitigating factor that public health could put?
Yeah, as far as I know, it doesn't pose a huge threat because it is going into the wastewater system. And the amount of dilution that occurs in the wastewater usually washes it out. That being said, there was one very large meth lab that we were involved with that was discovered because they were dumping so much down the drain that it caused a blockage for the neighborhood. And when it was investigated, that's how they came back and actually found that meth lab. And in that case, there was a potential risk because they had blocked it, and there was the gases could come back up the other way, as well as for those workers going and investigating that. So I wouldn't say that there's no risk, but generally it does get diluted in it.
I just don't know how much of a potential concern that is when reclaimed water may become more and more popular.
Absolutely.
Reclaim using wastewater for
and with
repurposing of land irrigation, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and if there was a high enough concentration of it, then it could become present in the water, absolutely.
Can I ask another question? You didn't speak too much about fentanyl labs. And I recall even in Vancouver, there was a fentanyl lab, illicit fentanyl lab busted in a residential site. So I'm curious about the cleanup, post-cleanup scenario. Who determines whether or not the residuals post-cleanup would be safe for rehabilitation? And had that been even
So we have done fentanyl cleanup, supervised it, and it's my opinion, and this isn't every other hygienist may have different opinions, but you want zero.
Right.
You want to do your swipe sampling and you want nothing.
Because the LD50 fentanyl is not known. There's not much in the literature about this at all.
No, and in addition to things with fentanyl, there's other drugs, W18, which even has less available known information. And we often go to the US because they have a bigger population. They've got more issues with drugs. They've got more research. We can kind of piggyback on a lot of their things. When we were dealing with a W18 lab, there was nowhere in the US that could even analyze for it. So we actually had to find a Canadian lab that developed a method so we could even test for it.
Can I ask one more related question
Yeah.
to that? The lab that tested the W18 or even fentanyl, do you know if they have the LOD?
You know what? I don't know. I off the top of my, like, in terms of what their detection limit is for, I could look it up, but I don't have it off the top of my head. Yeah.
Okay, I'm stealing the mic from Lydia. A couple of online questions. First of all, what kind of cartridges would you use in your powered respirators?
We usually use organic vapor acid gas particulate cartridges.
Thank you. And second question is around other companies doing the same type of work. Are you all using the same sort of cleanup standards, or are your standards the total safety standards and other companies have different standards?
I would have to say each company is doing their own individual level of assessments. There's not as many of the meth labs. When there was a lot of grow-ups going on, you kind of got a feel for what other companies were doing, and some definitely were doing something very similar to what we were choosing to do, but not everybody was. There's obviously going to be a range.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. I've learned a lot. I'm curious whether you've ever had to exercise your right to refuse hazardous work. So you've been asked, it's gotten to that stage where you've actually been invited into a home, but you personally feel it's so hazardous in your assessment, even though somebody else has decided not to demolish the house. I'm just curious if you've ever had to exercise that.
You know, not for the chemical contamination aspect. There has been a couple properties that I have walked into and partially through the inspection. We've chosen to leave because there has been other people there that we didn't expect to be. Somebody was choosing to occupy the house. So for that reason, yes, we have left, but not for the actual contamination of the building. There are some times that you only look in a very small portion of the building. So you may only be able to inspect 2 rooms. And you put together your recommendations for remediation, and doing that, you know that the best choice would be to demolish the house following that, because the cost to remediate is just not worth it.
I'm intrigued by the fact that you have to send samples down to the U.S. for analysis. Why are there no labs in Canada?
There are labs in Canada. It's a cost. So the labs in the U.S. analyze them. It's cheaper to get them analyzed there. So it's instead of spending $500 per sample, you may be able to get them in the U.S. for $300 a sample. So it really becomes it's a matter of economics. They have a much higher volume of samples that go through, so they're able to decrease their price.
Have you ever come across any multifamily residences that you've had to do some inspections with?
Yeah.
And where does that typically lead? Do all the families have to move out in a building, or?
It varies. So if it's a home that has a number of suites in it, whether it's 2 or 3 suites, usually in that case, all families would have to vacate the house. An apartment building, usually the rest of the apartments stay occupied, and it is just that unit. And it does, for the apartments or townhomes, can get quite complicated because of the strata issues and who's covering what portion. So the unit itself may be covered by the homeowner, but then if there is contamination in the hallway or the elevator or the common ventilation systems, that actually falls on a strata issue, and it can take a long time to resolve those issues, just to figure out who's actually going to pay for it, for the cleanup.
Hi, just with regards to different like contaminations and stuff like that, you talk about like they have to clean the insulation, but you have to remove the wall to do that. Is there like provisions for like sealing the wall in some way, like putting another layer of like sealing it with some sealing paint, something, put another layer of drywall on top? I mean, if you can contain it, is that passable? Or because I know I had a fire in my house, and a lot of what they did was not tearing things out, putting new things in, it was sealing the smoke in so that it couldn't.
So it couldn't outgas. So that probably, it depends on exactly what the hazard is that you're dealing with. So in terms of sealing for smoke damage, they're often sealing it so it's an odor issue. So it's you're not dealing with like a long-term health-based issue, but you're sealing it so the odors can't come out and it's not it's not unpleasant. The problem with when you're dealing with an illegal substance and its presence, if you consume it, so let's say you're ingesting it, that's the kind of most hazardous route of exposure for that. If you just seal it within a wall cavity and 10 years down the road somebody takes out that wall, they're doing renovations, they don't know the contamination's there. So I'm of the approach that you want to remove it. The exception may be like a concrete floor that it's been cleaned several times, and you can't get a little bit of residual out of that, particularly in a multi-story building. Taking out that concrete floor may not be an option. So in that case, you could seal it in, but it would be a subfloor that would have a finish on the end.
Okay, just with, okay, say you have a 1-bedroom house, 1 bathroom, 1 kitchen. Just curious on how many samples roughly you'd be doing for wipes. So, like, obviously you'd be wanting to do the floor for the toddlers, and you'd probably do the wall, probably the roof, or no?
Sometimes the attic space, if inside the attic, and then definitely in the ventilation ducts. So it depends on, usually you try and do the bathroom exhaust, the kitchen exhaust, and then if it has a forced air heating, at least 1 supply and 1 return on a small home. I mean, for standard house, for clearance, it can be upwards of 20 samples very easily.
Well, thank you for the very interesting presentation, Jennifer. I would like another round of